Hi everyone, I'm Nicole, welcome to my channel, and we're going to be taking this birdhouse that I found at Michael's and we're going to be turning it into Baba Yaga's hut. But the first step is to make it look a lot less like a birdhouse and more like a little tiny house. So I'm just removing these pieces that we're not going to need because no bird shall be living in this birdhouse. There was some excess glue along some of the areas that I got rid of, and I gave it a light sanding because this thing was full of splinters. Now I'm going to be using Fix-It Sculpt. It's a 2-part epoxy clay. You just mix it together and it cures rock hard. You do have a limited working time though, so keep that in mind if you use this. Now I'm going to start with plugging up that hole at the top. And I ended up plugging all the lines on top of the roof as well, so I could just start off with a nice clean slate. I found this loose bit here, so I went ahead and used some epoxy clay to strengthen that up so I didn't snap it while I was working on the house. I also went ahead and filled in any cracks I could find on the house as well, and it really made it look a lot nicer and a lot less like a cheap birdhouse I found at Michael's. I went ahead and made a template of the bird holes so that I could figure out unique ways to make them not look like little birdie holes and look more like windows and such. Then I cut a space so that we could make a chimney on this side of the house. Now I started off with all these fancy ideas and making all these fancy templates and blah blah blah, and then I just realized crumpling up some tinfoil and just smacking it on there with hot glue works just as well. I also figured out using some thicker cardboard was a lot easier, so I went ahead and used some of that and just made sure to use a lot of hot glue, and bam, chimney shape. I wanted the top to be thicker, so I just cut out some pieces and more hot glue, a crafter's best friend. Except for when you burn the ever-loving you-know-what out of yourself. I added on a couple more pieces for shape, and then added on some cardstock. You just want to make sure that whatever you're building on is nice and sturdy. You don't want it to move while you're trying to slap some clay on it. So for one of these bird holes, I just went ahead and put a frame around it because I'm going to put a big old frog that looks like apparently Jabba the Hutt in it. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, I made this clay medallion because I want to put it behind one of the bird holes. Is that what they're called? I don't know what they're called. Anyway, you put it behind it and voila, it looks like a door and not like a bird hole. I added a ton of texture so that this looks very weathered and cool. Then I drilled some holes so it looks like stars when we're going to have some light shining through it. I had to fill in the damage of when I just ripped off that bird perch, sanded it smooth, and used a tool to add some texture so it blends in with the wood grain. Now for the other side of the house, to balance out our chimney, we're going to build a big, cool, magical tree. So I start off with these little things that look like tentacles here, and I just twisted them together, and this is going to be our tree. You can get all artful and creative with the little tentacles. Stick them wherever you want to stick them. I wanted this one to go to the front too. And here I'm adding roots because this is a magical tree and it does not need dirt, okay? Just go with it. It's artistic. We want less tentacly and more tree. So we're going to start blending everything together and then start giving it that tree texture. I used this needle tool and I also used a toothbrush to give it that nice bark texture. Now I was originally going to do a shingled roof and I realized that was going to take me 14 million years. So we're going to do a hay roof instead. Very traditional, very cool, still took 14 million years. The steps are pretty easy though. You just add your clay in, smooth it out, use a needle tool to give you those hay lines. This is just 3 needles combined together. This is going to give us the ends of our hay. You can do this with 1 needle as well, and then I use some water on a paintbrush to smooth out any ridges or any fingerprints, and then I just repeat the process for 14 million years. For our chimney, we're just going to use even sheets of clay and stick it right onto our base of our armature that we made. This is why you want it to be sturdy. You're going to be pushing on it quite a lot. Just get everything kind of smooth, and then I'm going to use my secret tool, which is a rock. It turns out rock makes a very good rock texture. Don't overthink it. I used some crunched up tin foil to get to any of the spots I couldn't reach with my handy dandy rock. And I decided to make some flowers to go on our branches. You basically start off with a bunch of grapes and you just texture them. Now don't texture them too much, you want to still have some of that shape. And then I added them to all the vines. I tried making some leaves to go on it too and it just didn't look right. Here you can make whatever type of flower you want. I added some stems to connect it to our branches. And use some water and some tools to move things around and get it looking really nice. I would like to thank my dog Jenny for contributing her fur to most of my art projects. Thank you. Anyway, we're gonna make some bricks. They're super easy to make because you're just gonna make a brick shape with some clay, and then you're just gonna texture the heck out of it with a toothbrush. Yes, you heard me. Don't use this one for your teeth and for your art. Get yourself an art toothbrush. For the top of our chimney, I added some bricks. I'm just using a needle tool here. And then adding, of course, a bunch more texture. This is all about texture. I mean, look at that. Pretty convincing, right? I went ahead and put a door on the back of our house. I have to be able to fit my fat little hand in there to do the windows later. And I thought, why not make it light up? Now we're gonna add some added detail to our chimney to make it extra awesome. I'm just cutting 3, I don't know what you call these, like tubes of clay? Cylinders? Who knows? Anyway, I'm doing the big one in the middle, and then I'm going to be doing 2 smaller ones on the side. You add some lines and twist it, and then you got a cool shape. Of course, add texture. Just always add texture. Now, to add Jabba the Frog into the window. I'm just using more Apoxie Sculpt, and then I stuck him right onto the window, and then I retextured it so it matched with the texture on the window. And voila, giant frog in the window. Now we're going to start working on the top of the roof. I'm going to do it in sections. If we did it all in one, it would look really boring. So I'm adding these spaces in between the sections, and we're going to add a little detail in there later that looks so good. I'm just going to use the same technique I used on the lower part of the roof and just keep that pattern going. And here I am making a template badly, but it worked. Putting a sheet of glass on top of it. And we're gonna make a kind of crossed wood pattern. It's gonna give it more of a traditional look and just be an added detail to the roof. Here I'm just adding my wood grain just like with the tree. And since Fix It Sculpt is also an adhesive, I can use it to stick this part right onto the roof. And you can see how snazzy this is looking. I just continue on and finish up the rest of the roof on the house, leaving room for the detail later. And here you can see we're adding that in. I'm no professional hay roof maker, but it looks pretty good. I'm adding some texture to those pieces so they're not so boring, and I decided to add a piece to the bottom part of the roof as well so it all blended together nicely. Then I made some wood end caps for the edges of the roof to hide some of the birdhouse. And here I'm just doing a lot of wood texturing using my tools, and this gives it a really cool effect and nice texture. And then I just went for it, you guys. I started covering up any area that I didn't like with more wood beams. And you just wood beam your little heart out because it looks great. Especially covering up anything that looks like plywood. And just remember, texture, texture, texture. I'm just trimming this house out. Off camera, I made a fun looking door knocker for the front of our door. I just used epoxy clay to affix it to our door. And I guess this is me Vanna Whiting the trim. I'm very proud of it apparently. You can see how much it changes the look of the birdhouse. Now we're going to work on our chicken eye. I used a large glass cabochon, painted a black pupil first, and then put the orange paint over that. Then I'm using epoxy clay to stick it right to our door. I'm going to start bulking out the area around the eye. I start with the middle and then add some around the top. Then I'm going to add even more clay on top of that for a nice thick eyelid. I really went heavy with the texture here to make it more interesting. And then of course, my favorite little toothbrush. Then I wiped it down with some water. Then adding more clay to really open up that eye area and blending it into the door. We really want it to look like it's a part of the door in the house itself. Now getting feather shapes really isn't that hard. We're going to start off with a teardrop shape and use our needle tool to get those indents to make our feathers. The larger ones I'm going to do more detailed, but the smaller ones I'm going to leave simpler. For the window panes, I'm going to be using some tracing paper. I simply made a template, traced it out, and then covered it with packing tape on both sides. This is going to let the light shine out, but for you not to be able to see inside of the house. Now we're going to take this house from cute to creepy, using some little skeleton heads I bought off of Amazon and some push molds. Making these push molds is really easy, but getting the clay out not so much. But I just went ahead and fixed anything that got smashed, and then I tried to modify them so I had even more variation. I went ahead and cut some in half so they fit at the top of my wall. I also made some stops for the inside of my door. That way the door didn't fall through and latched properly. Now I'm going to be using this glue to glue on all of my skulls. I want this to just be one huge wall of skulls. You want to make sure that it closes and opens properly. So mind where it closes and also where the hinges are when it opens. Now that we have all of our skulls, we're going to cement them into the wall. We want it to look like plaster, like these skulls are coming out of the plaster. So I'm taking Apoxie Sculpt and pushing it in between all of the skulls. I'm leaving some texture so it looks like plaster, and just making sure to cover all the little cracks and crevices. Once I had all the skulls placed, I went and filled in any areas where there were gaps with more small feathers. Now we can move on to making our chicken feet, and luckily I've made a pretty big pair of bird feet already for my art doll Sparrowhawk. He's one of the biggest things I've ever made, and my favorite. There's no point for this other than showing him off. You know it's getting serious when I take out the armature box. Now, first thing we're going to do is look at what a chicken leg actually looks like. You can go off the bones of an actual chicken, and you just want to replicate that with wire. I got this wire from Home Depot. I'm using 2 pieces of it, it's a braided wire. Then making myself my toes, and then winding it together. I'm just making sure I put bends in the right spot, and that everything is looking good. You also want to make sure your feet are the right size for your house. You don't want them too big or too small. I've got armature for my toenails as well, and I put them up to each other to make sure they're both the same size and look good compared to my skeleton. And then we do a little dancey dance, just for fun. Now I'm going to start with adding a thin layer of clay over the whole armature. This is going to stop the metal from bending and keep it in the position that I want as I add more of the clay on top of it. Now I added some tin foil to bulk out our juicy thighs, and then I'm just taking a sheet of clay and putting it over the top. Now we're going to start working on the underside of our chicken foot. You can look at references to understand the anatomy of the bottom of the foot if you'd like. I make out balls of clay because it makes sure that the feet are the same size and that everything is symmetrical. I'm just making the pads of the feet and then blending them into the armature itself. Then of course, adding more texture. Next, we're going to work on those nails, and I want them to look scary. I used a combination of my fingers and tools to get that shape, making sure that it's blended into the base really well. You also want to make sure that your toenails are not crooked and they line up with the bone of the foot. I'm taking equal parts for each toe, and I'm cutting the top out. Each piece of clay will go on top of the toe and wrap around the toenail. I'm blending this part into the bottom part of the foot that we made earlier. And here you can see I'm taking some of the detail from the bottom of the foot, where the foot creases, and taking that up the foot. Then you want to add texture so that everything blends together and looks like one piece. We're going to start bulking out the upper part of the leg. I'm going to add some clay over the entire piece, and then I'm adding a bit more towards the top where the thigh is and the bottom where the toes are. We want to shape it and give it more of an hourglass shape so that it doesn't just look like a stick, it looks like a real leg with muscle and tendons. Then of course adding texture always makes everything look better. Then I'm going to add the little webbing between the toes. This is going to make it look cool, but it's also going to help with stability and strength. Now for scales, they're easy. I take equal parts of clay, roll it into balls, then I smash it into a circle and blend it into the foot. I just do that one over the other, and then add some texture and details to it. Now I added a lip to the top of the thigh so it can fit into the holes that I drilled out in the bottom of the house. and you can see that the house sits on the lip that I made on the top of the thigh. You're also going to want to make sure that when you're testing your legs that you use a level so that your house isn't wonky. Now for the larger scales, it's really easy. You just make a rectangular type piece of a scale like we did for the toes. Here I'm not overlapping them as much, and I'm making sure that they're defined between each scale and adding that texture. And since we want our house to look good from the front and the back, I decided to add more detail to the back of the legs. I just added some feathers and used a ball of clay, and we're going to be making this into a resin bead. I added a couple more details, and now we can move on to making the feathers for the thighs. These look almost like flower petals. You can make your feathers look however you want. I decided not to try to wipe away or use water to wipe off the fingerprints and leave it as added texture. Then I textured these feathers a lot using my Exacto blade. Wanted these to be shaped out and flared a bit so they looked fluffy. So I really focused on the shape of each one and making sure that it sat the way I wanted it to. Then I went back after and added the middle feather detail. I also made sure that each of my legs were labeled so I knew which one went where so that everything fit together perfectly. And now that we have all our pieces, we can move on to the fun stuff, which is painting. Now, depending on what colors you're using can determine what you want your base coat to be. I know I'm going to be using a lot of darker colors and metallics, which work well with a black base coat. So I just used my airbrush to airbrush all of the pieces with a nice dark black. Getting into all the areas in the house and on the legs was a little tricky, but with the airbrush it was a lot easier. Now to get the antique old world vibe I'm looking for, I'm going to be using dry brushing for the rest of this piece. Dry brushing is where you use very little paint with a dry paintbrush. This lets you put a moderate amount of paint on your piece, and it lets the color underneath come through, which is what we want. It really brings out the detail, and you can layer it very nicely. Here I'm using a mix of copper and gold on the legs. It gives it a little bit of a steampunk look, which I actually kind of love. Here I'm going to make sure those nails are nice and crisp. Who doesn't love a great manicure, you know? Even a Baba Yaga hut loves it. Now for the feathers, I'm just going to use a tiny bit of silver. This is just to bring out the details and the texture of the feathers, but still keep that black undertone. Don't forget the little ones on the back of your foot either. I'm going to use all the colors we used on our chicken leg and use it on our chicken eye. That way everything blends together really nicely and looks cohesive. I'm not worried about the paint that's on the actual eye. You can scrape it off of your eye later, after you're done painting. Now I spent hours on these skulls and I want them to pop. So I'm going to be dry brushing some antique white over all of them to really bring them out. Then I'm going to make some brown washes and put that over the paint so we get different colors and it's just not one monotone color for all of our skulls. Then I went through and blacked out all the eyes to make it extra creepy. And I wanted our lock on our door to look really magical, so I added some red paint and gold detail, and then scraped all the paint off of the eye very carefully. Here I wanted a really bold red door, a door that says, "Stay away, there's possibly a scary witch that lives in here and you should leave right now, but you're not because you're curious, you can't help yourself." And after that, we're going to add some weathering to this house. We want it to look old and creepy. And here I'm just also doing the little frog window and painting the details on our door knocker. Now we can move on to the roof. I'm starting off with a really light tan and just dry brushing in layers. Once I have a nice even coat, I'm going in with a darker color on each side and then highlighting it with an antique white, and you can see how much that makes the roof pop and look three-dimensional. Then I'm going over all those middle pieces with black so that we can add the red. Once again, a big huge warning on this roof to anybody who stumbles upon this house, but if they're anything like me, they're not gonna listen. Now we want to make our chimney look like stone. I'm starting off with a dark gray base coat. Then I'm going to add varying degrees of grays and browns. This is going to give it some variation and make it look more realistic. and I painted whatever those little doohickeys are at the top of the chimney black. I wanted them to look like metal. I went in with the little silver after that. Now it's time for our frog. I'm dry brushing him 2 colors of green. His eyes were yellow at first, then I painted him black, definitely not because I messed up the first pair. And after some eye shine, him and his one thought are good to go. Then I wanted to add more metallic details to the rest of the house. I'm using this gorgeous metallic blue, and this is going to break up the black of the house. Then we want to weather it. We want to give it some age, some personality. I used a gray for this and did it around all the edges of the house. Now we can go ahead and paint all the wood on the house. This is going to be a really nice accent to the rest of the colors and break up a little more of that black. I used 2 colors over the whole brown, starting with a darker color and then a lighter color. I wanted to make sure that the tree color was different than the rest of the trim on the house so it wasn't too matchy-matchy, and then decided to add some gold accents to some of the details I made on the house as well that I maybe forgot to film. I painted some of the details on the back of our chicken foot to match the details on the house. And here I'm just dry brushing our magical little tree. Now I want to move on to our flowers. I wanted an autumn, Halloween vibe for this. So I used some oranges and yellows, and now for my secret ingredient. It's just color shift paint. I love it. And you can see once I add that on top, it really gives it a magical feel. And along with some of this watered down glitter paint over all of the tree branches, our tree truly does look magical. And since I can't help myself when it comes to glitter, I painted the inside of our bead black and then added some glitter to our chicken foot, along with the front of the door detail. I used different size dotting tools to help me add paint details to the rest of the house. I'm not that great at freehanding complex paintings, so using the dotting tools added some nice details, but it was also a lot easier to do, especially with such tight quarters on this house. After I was done painting all my pieces, I sprayed them down with a matte varnish, and then I glossed the eyes of our frog and the tongue, and our painting is finished. I removed any tape that I put over my details that I didn't want sprayed with varnish. Now we can finish our resin beads. Over the glitter, we're going to add some drops of UV resin and cure them, and it makes some very cool looking glittery beads. And I use that same exact technique on the back of our door, and you can see how cool these look. Now it's time to put in our windows. Was it tricky to get my little hands in there and put them in? Yes, it was, but I did it. Now I'm going to add some lace that I antiqued with some paint and use that as our curtains with our little frog window. I went ahead and removed some excess armature that I had, and using a very level surface, I'm going to assemble my legs with my house. I'm using epoxy clay as the adhesive just in case I need to level it a bit. Make sure everything is set exactly how you want it, and then you can leave it to dry. I used some very tiny eye screw hooks and added them to the underside of the house, being careful not to come through the other side. Then I used some chain, first on the connection between the house and the leg for an added detail. For the rest of the chain, I'm going to attach it using jump rings to the house. If you enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to subscribe so you can see what crazy art projects I'm up to next. I attached some of these antique bells that I had to finish it off. And then I added a key detail to the back in case you were dumb enough to use that key to open up a door to this house.